Texas Ranger William Crawford's weathered hand froze mid-slice against the ancient saguaro, his hunting knife suspended in air as Sergeant's barking turned to something he'd never heard before, raw, primal terror that made his blood ice over. The metallic scraping beneath the cactus flesh wasn't bark or wood, it was steel. Sergeant dropped to his belly. Hackles bristled like black needles, his 8 years of bomb detection training screaming through every trembling muscle as he army crawled backward from the bulging trunk. The German shepherd's eyes locked onto Bill's with desperate intelligence, the same look he'd worn in Afghanistan when death lurked invisible in the sand. Bill's mind flashed to Mary Beth's last words 3 years ago. "Trust that dog, Billy. He sees what we can't." As his radio crackled with static that shouldn't exist 40 miles from civilization. Someone had been listening. Someone had been waiting. "Get back, Sergeant," Bill commanded, his voice steady despite his hammering heart, knowing that in 30 years of law enforcement he'd learned to trust 2 things, his gut and his dog. Right now, both were screaming. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 8 years ago, William Crawford had been a different man. Before Mary Beth's cancer, before the sleepless nights in sterile hospital corridors, before the crushing weight of medical bills that still haunted his mailbox like vengeful ghosts. Back then, he'd been Sergeant Major Crawford, leading men through the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where every sunrise could be your last, and every shadow might hide death. That's where he'd first met Sergeant, not as his dog, but as the pride and joy of Corporal Tommy Patterson, a kid from El Paso with eyes bright as morning stars and a laugh that could cut through the desert's oppressive silence. Tommy had trained Sergeant from a pup, molding him into the finest bomb detection dog the unit had ever seen. The German shepherd could sniff out an IED buried 3 feet deep, could sense danger before it materialized, could save lives with nothing more than a whine or a paw. Until the day Tommy didn't come home. The explosion had been sudden, brutal, final. One moment Tommy was checking a suspicious pile of rubble, Sergeant at his side, tail wagging with professional confidence. The next, there was nothing but smoke, screaming, and the acrid taste of cordite that still haunted Bill's dreams. When the dust settled, they'd found Sergeant cowering behind a wall, physically unharmed but mentally shattered, his handler's blood on his fur and guilt carved into his intelligent brown eyes. Bill had volunteered to adopt him without hesitation. 2 broken souls deserved each other, he'd reasoned, and perhaps together they could find a way to heal. The transition hadn't been easy. Sergeant would wake screaming from nightmares, just like Bill. The dog would flinch at loud noises, just like Bill, and sometimes in the quiet moments they'd both stare at nothing, seeing ghosts that nobody else could understand. But slowly, methodically, they'd rebuilt their lives together. Bill had left the military, used his skills to become a Texas Ranger, and Sergeant had learned to trust again. Their morning patrols through the vast emptiness of the borderlands had become a ritual of redemption. 2 veterans watching over a land that demanded vigilance from those who understood the price of freedom. Mary Beth had loved Sergeant immediately. "He's got sad eyes, just like his daddy," she'd say, scratching behind the dog's ears, while Bill pretended not to notice how the gesture made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. During her final months, when the cancer stole everything but her spirit, Sergeant had rarely left her bedside. He'd sensed her approaching death weeks before the doctors admitted defeat, his mournful whines serving as a countdown to heartbreak. Now 3 years after burying the love of his life, Bill's world had shrunk to this: sunrise patrols with his 4-legged partner, a modest pension that barely covered the bills, and the endless expanse of Texas desert that never asked questions and never judged. He'd thought he'd found peace in this simple existence. He'd been wrong. The cactus loomed before them now, its unnatural bulge seeming to pulse in the morning heat like a metallic tumor that had been growing in the desert's heart for decades. The desert held its breath as Bill approached the cactus with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned that haste killed more soldiers than enemy bullets. Sargent had retreated 15 feet but remained locked in position, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement with the intensity of a sniper's scope. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows that made the bulge in the saguaro's base look like a malignant growth against the pristine blue sky. Bill's radio crackled softly on his belt, a routine check-in from dispatch that he ignored for now. Something about this discovery demanded his complete attention. The hunting knife felt heavy in his weathered hand as he pressed the blade against the cactus flesh once more. The metallic scraping sound echoed across the empty landscape, a discordant note in nature's symphony that made his skin crawl with recognition. He'd heard that sound before. In Afghanistan. The screech of metal against metal when Tommy had pried open that suspicious container, the one that had seemed too perfectly placed, too convenient. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment the Texas desert transformed into the mountains of Helmand Province, where the air tasted of dust and death, and every morning brought fresh graves. Sargent whined, a low, mournful sound that pulled Bill back to the present. The dog's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated, his military training reasserting itself in ways Bill hadn't seen since those first dark months after Tommy's death. The German shepherd's ears were pinned flat against his skull, his body coiled like a spring ready to launch into action or flee from danger. "Easy, boy," Bill murmured, but his own voice carried uncertainty. In 8 years together, he'd never seen Sargent react this way to anything that wasn't genuinely dangerous. With deliberate strokes, Bill began carving away the outer layer of the cactus, revealing more of the metallic surface beneath. It was definitely a container of some kind, roughly the size of a coffin, buried so deep within the plant's flesh that it must have been there for decades. The saguaro had grown around it, embracing the foreign object and making it part of its own body, a biological safe that only time and circumstance could crack open. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and creosote, but also something else, something that made Sargent's hackles rise even higher. Bill paused, knife suspended mid-cut, as his own senses began picking up what his partner had detected minutes earlier. There was a wrongness to this place, a feeling that crawled up his spine like ice water and whispered warnings in a voice that sounded remarkably like Mary Beth's. His radio crackled again, louder this time, but the voice that emerged wasn't dispatch. It was static-filled, distorted, but unmistakably human. Someone was monitoring their frequency, listening to their every breath, their every movement. Bill's hand instinctively moved to his sidearm as his mind raced through the implications. Nobody should know they were here. This patrol route was random, unscheduled, known only to Bill himself. Yet someone was watching, waiting, perhaps had been waiting for years for this moment. The thought chilled him more than the desert wind ever could. Sargent suddenly stood, his attention riveted on the horizon to the north. Bill followed his gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. Dust clouds were rising in the distance, multiple vehicles moving fast across the hardpan, heading directly toward their location. Too fast for tourists, too organized for smugglers, too many for a routine border patrol sweep. "Son of a bitch," Bill breathed, understanding flooding through him like poison. This wasn't a discovery. It was a trap. Someone had been waiting for him to find this container, had been monitoring police frequencies, had known exactly when and where to strike. But who and why? The vehicles were closer now, close enough for Bill to make out their dark silhouettes against the pale desert floor. 3, maybe 4 trucks, moving with military precision across terrain that would challenge most civilian drivers. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic scavengers. These were professionals, and they were coming for whatever lay hidden inside that cactus. Sergeant barked once, sharp and commanding, a sound Bill recognized as a final warning. The dog's eyes met his own, and in that moment of perfect communication between species, Bill understood. Run. Run now, or face whatever was coming with nothing but a sidearm and a prayer. But the container called to him, its metallic surface gleaming like forbidden treasure in the morning sun. Whatever was inside had been hidden for decades, protected by living flesh and desert silence. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury it here, and now someone else was willing to kill to claim it. The dust clouds were less than 10 minutes away. Bill Crawford had a choice to make. 10 years of muscle memory took over as Bill's training kicked in like a cold engine roaring to life. He dropped the knife and grabbed his radio, keying the emergency channel with practiced efficiency while his eyes tracked the approaching dust clouds. Ranger Crawford to dispatch. Code red at grid reference 77 Alpha. Multiple hostile vehicles approaching. Request immediate backup and air support. Static answered him. Dead. Empty static that confirmed his worst fears. Someone had jammed their communications, cut them off from the outside world as effectively as if they'd been dropped on the dark side of the moon. Bill cursed under his breath, a string of words that would have made Mary Beth reach for her wooden spoon, and mentally calculated their options. The nearest town was 40 miles east, the Border Patrol station 30 miles north, and his truck was a quarter-mile behind them across open ground that offered no cover whatsoever. Sergeant had moved closer, positioning himself at Bill's left side in the classic protection formation they'd practiced countless times. The dog's entire body vibrated with tension, his dark eyes fixed on the approaching vehicles with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. 8 years of peaceful retirement had done nothing to dull his combat instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming that death was racing toward them across the desert floor. Bill made his decision with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through 3 tours of duty. He attacked the cactus with renewed fury, carving away chunks of flesh with desperate efficiency as precious seconds ticked away. Whatever was hidden inside this ancient plant was worth killing for, and that made it worth dying to protect. The metallic scraping grew louder as more of the container revealed itself, a corroded steel surface that spoke of decades buried in the desert's embrace. The vehicles were close enough now for Bill to count them. 4 trucks, dark and anonymous, moving in formation across the hardpan with military precision. No random smugglers or opportunistic criminals moved like that. These were professionals, and they'd been planning this intercept for far longer than Bill cared to contemplate. With a final, violent thrust of his blade, Bill broke through the last barrier of cactus flesh. The container split open with a groan of protesting metal, revealing its contents to the harsh desert sun for the first time in God knew how many years. What he saw inside made his breath catch in his throat and his knees nearly buckle with shock. Money. More money than he'd ever seen in one place, stacked in neat bundles and wrapped in plastic that had yellowed with age. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions, enough to solve every financial problem that had plagued him since Mary Beth's illness. But it wasn't the cash that made his hands tremble as he reached into the container. It was the documents. Yellowed papers bound with rubber bands that crumbled at his touch, revealing typewritten pages covered in names, dates, locations, and transactions. His eyes scanned the faded text with growing horror, recognizing code names and operational details that belonged to a world he'd thought he'd left behind in the mountains of Afghanistan. The ghost caravan wasn't just local legend. It was real, and it was connected to military operations that should have stayed classified until the end of time. One name jumped out at him like a physical blow. Patterson, James R. Colonel, United States Army. Bill's hands went numb as recognition flooded through him. Jim Patterson, Tommy's father, his old friend and fellow officer. The man who'd served as best man at his wedding, who'd held Mary Beth's hand during her chemotherapy treatments, who'd stood beside him at Tommy's funeral with tears streaming down his weathered face. The vehicles were less than 5 minutes away now, close enough for Bill to make out their occupants through the dust and heat shimmer. Armed men in tactical gear, faces hidden behind dark glasses and military-style helmets. But in the lead truck behind the windshield, Bill could see a figure that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Colonel James Patterson sat in the passenger seat, his familiar profile unmistakable even at this distance. The man who'd sworn to protect and serve, who'd raised his son to believe in honor and duty and sacrifice, was leading a convoy of killers across the desert to silence the truth forever. Sergeant's growl deepened, a sound like distant thunder that spoke of violence barely held in check. The dog had recognized something too, a scent, a sound, a memory that connected this moment to that terrible day in Afghanistan when Tommy had died screaming in the dust. Bill's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The explosion that had killed Tommy hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated, planned, executed by someone who knew exactly where the young soldier would be and when he'd be there. Someone who'd needed to silence Tommy before he could report what he'd discovered about the ghost caravan's connection to military operations in Afghanistan. Someone like his own father. "Jesus Christ," Bill whispered, the words torn from his throat like broken glass. The container held more than money and documents. It held the truth about Tommy's death, about corruption that reached into the highest levels of military command, about a conspiracy that had claimed innocent lives to protect guilty secrets. The first truck was close enough now for Bill to see Jim Patterson's face clearly through the windshield. The older man's expression was cold, determined, empty of the warmth and humor that had defined their friendship for over 2 decades. This wasn't the Jim Patterson who'd taught Bill how to field strip a rifle, who'd shared countless beers and war stories, who'd cried like a baby when Tommy was born. This was a stranger wearing his friend's face. A killer hiding behind a uniform and a badge and 30 years of distinguished service. Sergeant barked once, sharp and commanding, snapping Bill back to the present moment. The dog's message was clear. Whatever you're going to do it now. The trucks were less than 2 minutes away, close enough for Bill to hear the roar of their engines across the desert silence. In moments, they'd be surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned by men who'd kill without hesitation to protect their secrets. Bill grabbed handfuls of the documents and stuffed them into his shirt, the brittle paper crackling against his chest like dried leaves. The money he left untouched. Blood money wasn't worth dying for, but the truth was worth everything. Sergeant pressed against his leg, solid and reassuring, a reminder that whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The lead truck was close enough now for Bill to see Jim Patterson reaching for a radio, his lips moving as he coordinated the final phase of an operation that had been planned with military precision. In seconds, they'd be trapped, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide in the vast emptiness of the Texas desert. Bill Crawford had spent his entire adult life serving his country, protecting the innocent, standing between civilization and chaos. Now he faced his greatest test, armed with nothing but his sidearm, his courage, and a German shepherd who'd already lost one handler to this conspiracy. The trucks were 100 yards away and closing fast. The first truck slammed to a halt in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes, its occupants spilling out with the practiced efficiency of a military assault team. Bill counted 8 men in total, all armed with automatic weapons, their faces hidden behind tactical masks that made them look like harbingers of death against the pristine desert backdrop. but his attention remained fixed on the passenger door of the lead vehicle as Colonel James Patterson stepped out into the blazing sun. 23 years of friendship crumbled to ash as Bill looked into eyes that had once sparkled with warmth and humor, now cold as winter steel. Jim Patterson had aged since Tommy's funeral, his thick hair gone completely gray, deep lines carved into his weathered face by grief and something darker, something that had eaten away at his soul from the inside out like a cancer. "Hello, Billy," Patterson said, his voice carrying across the desert silence with the same authority that had once commanded respect in officers' clubs from Fort Bragg to Kandahar. "Been a long time since we've had a proper conversation." Bill's hand rested on his sidearm, though he knew the gesture was futile against 8 armed men. Sergeant pressed against his leg, a solid reminder of loyalty in a world gone mad with betrayal. The dog's hackles were raised, his lips pulled back in a silent snarl that spoke of barely restrained violence. "Jim," Bill replied, his voice steady despite the chaos raging in his chest. "Fancy meeting you out here in the middle of nowhere, almost like you knew I'd be coming." Patterson's smile held no warmth, only the bitter satisfaction of a man who'd planned every detail of this moment. "You always were too smart for your own good, Billy. Even back in Afghanistan, you asked too many questions, noticed too many things that didn't add up." "I used to admire that about you." The armed men had formed a loose perimeter around them, weapons ready but not directly aimed. Yet Bill recognized the formation, had used it himself in hostile territory when they needed information before eliminating a target. The thought chilled him more than the desert wind ever could. "The ghost caravan," Bill said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "It was never just about drug runners, was it? This was about military contracts, weapons shipments, money that disappeared from official budgets and ended up in private accounts." Patterson nodded slowly, almost sadly. "You always were quick to connect the dots. Yes, Billy, it was about money, lots and lots of money. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to run black operations that don't officially exist? Congress sure as hell wasn't going to fund the kind of work we needed to do to keep America safe." "So you turned to drug money." Bill's voice carried disgust that made several of the armed men shift uncomfortably. "You took blood money from cartels and used it to fund operations that killed American soldiers. I used whatever resources were available to protect American interests." Patterson's composure cracked for the first time, revealing the fury that burned beneath his carefully controlled exterior. "Do you think the enemy plays by our rules? Do you think they worry about congressional oversight when they're building bombs to kill our boys?" Sergeant's growl deepened, a sound like distant thunder that made the hair on Bill's arms stand up. The dog was remembering something, his trauma-damaged mind connecting present danger to past horrors in ways that transcended human understanding. Bill reached down and placed a steadying hand on the German shepherd's head, drawing strength from the animal's unwavering loyalty. "Tommy found out, didn't he?" Bill's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the desert like a gunshot. "Your own son discovered what you were doing, and he was going to report it." The transformation that came over Jim Patterson's face was horrifying to witness. The mask of military authority slipped completely, revealing something broken and desperate underneath. His hands trembled as he reached for a cigarette, the flame of his lighter wavering in the desert breeze like a prayer candle in an abandoned church. "Tommy was a good boy," Patterson said, his voice thick with emotions that had been festering for 8 years. "He believed in honor, duty, country, all the things I taught him growing up. He was going to throw away everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed for, because he couldn't understand that sometimes good men have to do bad things to protect what matters. So, you killed him." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence, and Bill watched as the remaining humanity in his old friend's eyes flickered and died. "I didn't kill my son." Patterson's voice cracked like a whip across the desert. "That IED was meant for you, Billy. You were getting too close, asking too many questions, making too many connections. Tommy just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." The words hit Bill like physical blows, each revelation more devastating than the last. The explosion that had haunted his dreams for 8 years, the guilt that had eaten away at his soul like acid, the nightmares that had driven him from his bed countless times, all of it had been orchestrated by the man standing before him. "But Tommy triggered it instead," Bill continued, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "Your own son died because of a bomb meant for me." Patterson's laugh was the sound of a man whose sanity had long since abandoned him. "Do you know what he said in his final moments, as he lay there bleeding in the dust? Do you know what my son's last words were?" Bill didn't answer, but Sergeant whined softly, as if the dog remembered that terrible day with crystalline clarity. He said, "Tell my dad I found it. Tell him I found the truth." Tears streamed down Patterson's weathered face, carving tracks through decades of accumulated dust and sin. Even dying, he was trying to protect his country from men like me. The desert held its breath as the full weight of the confession settled over them like a funeral shroud. 8 years of guilt, 8 years of carrying the burden of surviving when Tommy hadn't, 8 years of thinking he could have done something different, all of it based on a lie orchestrated by the dead boy's own father. Bill's hand tightened on his sidearm, but he made no move to draw it. Around them, the armed men waited with the patience of professionals, their weapons ready to end this confrontation the moment their employer gave the word. But something in Patterson's demeanor suggested that violence might not be the inevitable conclusion to this desert drama. "The money in that container," Bill said carefully. "That's from the ghost caravan operations?" Patterson nodded, wiping his face with the back of his hand. $2.3 million accumulated over 15 years of operations, plus documents that would destroy the careers of some very important people, men who trusted me to keep their secrets buried in the desert where they belonged. And now that I've found it, you have to kill me to protect those secrets." "I don't want to kill you, Billy." Patterson's voice carried genuine anguish, the pain of a man forced to choose between friendship and survival. "You're the only real friend I have left in this world. But you've seen too much, know too much. Those documents would start investigations that would reach all the way to Washington, would destroy men who've spent their entire lives serving this country." Sergeant shifted position, moving slightly forward in a protective stance that Bill recognized from their time together in Afghanistan. The dog's instincts were telling him that violence was imminent, that the talking phase of this confrontation was nearly over. Bill could feel the animal's muscles coiled beneath his fur, ready to spring into action at the first sign of hostile movement. "There's another way," Bill said, his mind racing through possibilities like a computer calculating trajectories. "Let me walk away, Jim. Let me take Sergeant and drive back to town, file a report that says I found nothing but an old cactus with a growth on it. No money, no documents, no ghost caravan." Patterson shook his head sadly. "You know I can't do that. You're too honorable, too committed to doing the right thing. Even if you agreed now, even if you gave me your word, you'd never be able to live with keeping this secret. It would eat away at you until you couldn't stand it anymore." The older man was right, and they both knew it. Bill Crawford had spent his entire adult life serving truth and justice, had buried his wife knowing he'd done everything possible to save her, had adopted a traumatized war dog because it was the right thing to do. The idea of covering up the truth about Tommy's death, about corruption that reached the highest levels of military command, was as foreign to his nature as breathing underwater. "Then we have a problem," Bill said quietly. Patterson nodded and raised his hand, a signal that made the armed men tense with anticipation. "I'm sorry, Billy. I truly am. But some secrets are worth more than friendship." That's when Sargent made his move. The German shepherd launched himself forward with the explosive power of his military training, 80 pounds of muscle and fury aimed directly at the nearest gunman. The man's weapon discharged wildly as he fell backward, bullets spraying harmlessly into the desert sky as Sargent's teeth found his throat with surgical precision. In the chaos that followed, Bill drew his sidearm and dove for cover behind the mutilated Cactus, his mind processing tactical information with the clarity of long experience. 8 hostile targets, unknown ammunition count, limited cover, no backup coming. The odds were impossibly against them, but Sargent had given him the only chance they were going to get. The desert erupted in gunfire as the professional facade of Patterson's operation crumbled into chaos and violence. Bill returned fire with careful precision, each shot calculated to make his limited ammunition count, while Sargent moved like a shadow of death among the armed men, using tactics learned in the mountains of Afghanistan to turn superior numbers against themselves. Patterson stood in the middle of the firefight, untouched by the violence swirling around him, his face a mask of grief and determination as he watched his carefully planned operation disintegrate into bloody chaos. In his hand, he held an antique service revolver, the same weapon he'd carried as a young lieutenant in Vietnam, now pointed directly at Bill's position behind the Cactus. The confrontation that had been building for 8 years was finally reaching its climax, and the desert would bear witness to the price of betrayal among brothers in arms. The desert exploded into chaos as automatic weapons fire shattered the morning silence, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly lightning against the pale sky. Bill pressed himself against the wounded Cactus, feeling chunks of ancient flesh explode around him as bullets carved away decades of growth in seconds. Sargent moved through the gunman like a phantom of vengeance, his military training transforming him from beloved pet into lethal weapon with terrifying efficiency. The first gunman went down screaming, Sargent's jaws clamped around his forearm with bone-crushing force. The man's rifle spun away across the hardpan as the German shepherd used his own momentum to drive him backward into one of his companions, both men tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs and automatic weapons. Bill used the distraction to put 2 rounds center mass into a third gunman who was trying to flank his position, watching the man crumple with the dispassionate efficiency of long experience. Patterson's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade, commanding his remaining men with the authority of a lifetime soldier. "Concentrate fire on the dog. Take out the dog first." His tactical assessment was coldly accurate. Sargent was the wild card in this equation, the element that had turned a controlled execution into a chaotic firefight. Remove the German shepherd from the equation, and Bill would be helpless against superior numbers and firepower. But Sargent had learned his lessons in the mountains of Afghanistan, where survival meant thinking 3 moves ahead of an enemy who wanted nothing more than to paint the rocks with American blood. The dog rolled away from a burst of automatic fire, came up running at an angle that put 2 of the gunmen in each other's line of fire, then launched himself at the nearest target with the precision of a guided missile. Bill counted shots in his head as he returned fire with careful precision. 12 rounds in his service weapon, 2 spare magazines on his belt, against at least 6 remaining hostiles with full auto capability. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple, and they didn't favor the home team. But mathematics had never accounted for the fury of a loyal dog or the determination of a man with nothing left to lose. A bullet cracked past his ear close enough to part his hair, followed by another that gouged a furrow in the Cactus inches from his head. Bill rolled left, came up in a modified Weaver stance, and put a round through the forehead of a gunman who thought he'd found a clear shot. The man's helmet flew off as he toppled backward, his weapon clattering across the desert floor like dice in a cosmic game where the stakes were measured in heartbeats. "Damn it, Billy!" Patterson's voice carried genuine anguish beneath its authoritative bark. "This doesn't have to end with both of us dead. Stand down and let's talk like civilized men." "Civilized men don't murder their own sons." Bill's response echoed across the desert as he changed magazines with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might falter. Around him, the surviving gunmen were reorganizing, using their superior numbers to establish overlapping fields of fire that would pin him down while they maneuvered for killing shots. Sargent had taken down 2 more of Patterson's men, but Bill could see that the dog was slowing, his movements less fluid than they'd been at the start of the engagement. 8 years of peaceful retirement hadn't erased his skills, but they'd inevitably dulled his edge. The German Shepherd was operating on pure heart now, loyalty and determination pushing him beyond the limits of aging muscle and bone. Patterson stepped into the open, his antique service revolver held in a perfect 2-handed grip that spoke of decades of range time and combat experience. At 65, he moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd never let his body go soft, never surrendered to the comfortable decline that claimed so many retired officers. His aim was steady as a rock as he tracked Sargent's movements across the battlefield. "I'm sorry, old friend," Patterson whispered, his words meant for the dog who'd once played with his son in the dusty streets of Kabul. "But this is where it ends." The revolver barked once, a sound like thunder in the desert morning, and Sargent stumbled mid-stride as the heavy slug caught him high in the shoulder. The German Shepherd rolled with the impact, came up limping but still dangerous, his dark eyes fixed on Patterson with an intensity that spoke of perfect understanding. This was the man who'd killed Tommy, the handler who'd loved Sargent more than life itself. This was the enemy who mattered most. Bill's world narrowed to a tunnel of rage and desperation as he watched his partner, his friend, his family, the last connection to everything good in his life, bleeding in the desert dust. The careful tactics of a lifetime soldier abandoned him completely as he rose from cover, his service weapon bucking in his hands as he put round after round toward Patterson's position. The remaining gunmen concentrated their fire on him, bullets whining past like angry hornets as Bill advanced across open ground with the inexorable determination of a man embracing his own death. One slug tugged at his shirt sleeve, another burned a groove across his ribs, but nothing could stop the momentum of his charge toward the man who'd betrayed everything they'd once sworn to protect. Patterson's second shot took Bill in the left shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. The pain was bright and immediate, familiar from other battlefields in other wars, but it couldn't penetrate the protective cocoon of fury that wrapped around his consciousness like armor. He kept coming, kept firing, watching Patterson's eyes widen with something that might have been respect or terror or both. "You always were too stubborn for your own good," Patterson said, his voice carrying clearly across the diminishing distance between them. His revolver tracked Bill's approach with professional calm, but something in his face had changed. The cold calculation of a career officer was cracking, revealing glimpses of the friend who'd once shared foxholes and nightmares, and the bonds that only warriors could understand. Sargent struggled to his feet, blood matting his thick coat where Patterson's bullet had torn through muscle and sinew. The dog's left front leg wouldn't bear weight, but his remaining 3 carried him forward with grim determination. His gaze never left Patterson's face, and in those intelligent brown eyes burned something deeper than mere animal fury. This was personal. This was justice for a beloved handler who died screaming in the dust of a foreign country, killed by the man who should have protected him above all others. The last of Patterson's gunmen went down under Bill's relentless advance, their superior firepower negated by his willingness to absorb punishment that would have stopped a sane man. One took a bullet through the chest and folded like a prayer, his weapon spinning away across the hardpan. Another tried to flee and made it exactly 6 steps before Bill's marksmanship sent him tumbling face first into a clump of sagebrush. Now it was just the 3 of them in the vastness of the Texas desert, 2 old soldiers and the dog who'd loved them both, who'd served them faithfully, who'd been caught between their war like an innocent bystander watching friends destroy each other over principles that seemed suddenly small beneath the immensity of the sky. Patterson's revolver was empty, but he made no move to reload. Instead, he stood perfectly still as Bill approached, his weathered hands hanging at his sides, his face calm with the acceptance of a man who'd finally reached the end of a very long road. Behind him, the sun climbed higher into the morning sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson that seemed appropriate for the conclusion of this tragedy. "Do it then," Patterson said quietly. "Put me out of my misery, Billy. God knows I've earned it." Bill's service weapon was trained on his old friend's chest, his finger taking up slack on the trigger with the precision of long practice. At this range, he couldn't miss. One squeeze, one report echoing across the empty landscape, and James Patterson would join his son in whatever afterlife awaited soldiers who'd lost their way in the moral wilderness of endless war. But as Bill stared into eyes that had once sparkled with humor and loyalty, he found himself thinking of Mary Beth's voice on countless Sunday mornings, reading from her worn Bible in the kitchen while breakfast cooked on the stove. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," she'd recite, her gentle voice carrying convictions that had sustained her through cancer treatments and the daily struggle of being married to a man whose job required him to see the worst of human nature. Sargent limped to Bill's side, pressing his wounded body against his human's leg in a gesture of support that transcended species barriers. The dog's dark eyes moved between the 2 men, sensing the weight of the moment, understanding in his animal way that whatever happened next would determine whether justice or revenge would carry the day. The desert held its breath as Bill Crawford faced the most important decision of his life, his finger poised on the trigger of a weapon that could end decades of friendship with one irrevocable squeeze. Around them, the bodies of Patterson's mercenaries lay scattered like broken toys, testament to the price of betrayal among brothers in arms. In the distance, a hawk circled on the thermals, patient as death itself, waiting to see which of these earthbound creatures would survive to walk away from this place where secrets had been buried in living flesh and watered with blood for far too long. The trigger felt impossibly heavy beneath Bill's finger as he stared into the face of the man who'd been like a brother to him for over 2 decades. Patterson stood motionless in the blazing desert sun, his empty revolver hanging useless at his side, waiting for judgment with the stoic acceptance of a soldier who'd finally reached the end of his war. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by Sargent's labored breathing and the distant cry of a circling hawk. "Go ahead, Billy," Patterson said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority that had once commanded respect from Kabul to the Pentagon. "We both know this is how it has to end. I killed my own son to protect secrets that weren't worth protecting. I've got more blood on my hands than Lady Macbeth, and there ain't enough water in the Rio Grande to wash it clean." Bill's shoulder burned where Patterson's bullet had carved a furrow through muscle and flesh, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony tearing at his soul. This man had been Tommy's father, had taught Bill how to field strip an M16 in the dark, had held Mary Beth's hand during her final moments when the cancer finally claimed her. The bonds forged in combat were supposed to be unbreakable, sacred, stronger than blood or marriage or any earthly consideration. But Tommy's blood was on those hands now, innocent blood spilled to protect guilty secrets. Sergeant whined softly, a sound that cut through Bill's torment like a knife through silk. The German shepherd was bleeding steadily from Patterson's bullet, his left shoulder matted with crimson fur, but his dark eyes remained fixed on his human with unwavering loyalty. Even wounded, even facing death in this godforsaken wasteland, the dog's only concern was for Bill's well-being. "You know what the worst part is?" Patterson continued, his weathered face crumbling with grief that had been festering for 8 years. "Tommy figured it out 3 days before he died. 3 days he carried that burden, knowing his old man was everything he'd been raised to despise. You want to know what he said to me that last night, when he called me on the satellite phone?" Bill didn't answer, couldn't answer, but Patterson continued as if the words were being torn from his throat by invisible hands. He said, "Dad, I found something that's going to break your heart, but I have to do what's right. My own son, trying to protect me even as he prepared to destroy everything I'd built." Tears carved tracks through the dust on Patterson's cheeks, making him look older than his 65 years. I could have told him the truth then. Could have explained why good men sometimes do terrible things. Instead, I set that IED and prayed to a God I'd stop believing in that you'd trigger it instead of him. The confession hit Bill like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears about Tommy's death, while simultaneously revealing the depth of Patterson's torment. This wasn't a man who'd killed without conscience. This was a father who'd been slowly dying inside for 8 years, eaten alive by the knowledge that he'd murdered his own child to protect a conspiracy that had long since lost any moral justification. Bill's finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed as Mary Beth's voice whispered in his memory. She'd always been the moral compass of their marriage, the one who insisted on seeing the best in people even when their worst impulses were on full display. "Every man deserves a chance at redemption, Billy," she'd said during one of their late-night conversations about the nature of justice and mercy. "Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to pull the trigger and when to find another way." "The money," Bill said finally, his voice rough with emotion and desert dust. "What was it really for? The ghost caravan, the black ops, all of it. What were you trying to accomplish that was worth Tommy's life?" Patterson's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "You want the truth? The real truth, not the patriotic bullshit I fed myself for 15 years? He gestured toward the scattered bodies of his mercenaries, men who'd followed him into the desert for blood money and found only death. "We were funding operations that Congress would never approve, strikes against targets that officially didn't exist. Dirty work in dirty places, but work that needed doing if we were going to keep America safe from the kind of people who'd cut your throat for sport. And when the official funding dried up, we found other sources. Cartel money, arms dealing, protection rackets, anything that would keep the operations running. The ghost caravan was just one revenue stream in a network that stretched from Colombia to Afghanistan." Patterson's voice carried the hollow ring of a man reciting his own epitaph. "We told ourselves we were patriots, that history would vindicate our methods even if it couldn't reveal our motives." Sergeant struggled to his feet, his wounded leg trembling with the effort. The German shepherd limped toward Patterson with deliberate purpose, each step a testament to the kind of courage that transcended species barriers. Bill watched in fascination as his partner approached the man who'd shot him, the man who'd killed his beloved first handler, the man who represented everything wrong with the world they'd all served. But instead of attacking, Sergeant sat down in front of Patterson and looked up into his face with those impossibly expressive brown eyes. The dog's gaze held no hatred, no desire for revenge, only a profound sadness that seemed to encompass all the loss and betrayal and wasted sacrifice that had brought them to this moment. "Jesus," Patterson whispered, sinking to his knees in front of the wounded animal. "He looks just like he did that day in Afghanistan. Same eyes, same expression, like he's trying to forgive me for something I can't forgive myself for. Bill's weapon remained trained on his old friend, but his resolve was wavering like heat shimmer on desert asphalt. This wasn't the cold-blooded killer he'd expected to face. This was a broken man whose grief had twisted him into something monstrous, whose love for his son had become the very weapon that destroyed them both. Tommy loved this dog more than life itself, Patterson continued, his weathered hands hovering inches from Sargent's bloodied fur. Used to say that Sargent was the only thing in Afghanistan that made sense, the only pure thing in a world gone mad with ideology and violence. And I killed them both to protect secrets that weren't worth a damn. The desert wind picked up, stirring dust devils across the hardpan and carrying with it the scent of sage and death. Bill felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like the heat of the climbing sun, demanding that he choose between justice and mercy, between the law he'd sworn to uphold and the forgiveness that Mary Beth had always preached. "The documents," he said finally. "The evidence about the ghost caravan, the names of everyone involved. That all dies here if I pull this trigger." Patterson nodded slowly. "Along with any chance of justice for the families who lost sons and daughters to our operations. You kill me, Billy, and the truth dies with me. Those families will never know why their children had to die, never get the closure they deserve." It was the final twist of the knife, the ultimate test of Bill's character. Kill Patterson and satisfy his need for vengeance, or let him live to face justice and ensure that other families might find the peace that had been denied to him for 8 years. The choice should have been simple for a man who'd devoted his life to upholding the law, but the sight of Sargent's blood soaking into the desert sand made it the hardest decision he'd ever faced. Sargent whined softly and extended his muzzle toward Patterson's trembling hands, a gesture of trust that defied every rational consideration. The dog, who'd lost everything to this man's betrayal, was offering forgiveness with the simple grace that only animals possessed, teaching his human a lesson about mercy that no sermon or philosophy book could convey. Bill's finger began to ease off the trigger as understanding flooded through him like cool water in the desert heat. This wasn't about Patterson's redemption or his own need for vengeance. This was about honoring the memory of everyone who'd died because of the ghost caravan's operations, about ensuring that their sacrifice might finally mean something positive in a world that had taken so much from so many. The hawk circled lower, its shadow passing over the 3 survivors like a benediction from a sky that had witnessed too much violence and was hungry for peace. In the distance, Bill could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching. His emergency beacon had finally been received, and help was coming across the wasteland with all the authority of law and order. Patterson heard it too, and his face relaxed with something that might have been relief or resignation or both. "Sounds like the cavalry's finally arrived," he said, with a ghost of his old humor. "Guess that makes the decision for you, doesn't it?" Bill lowered his weapon slowly, the weight of it suddenly unbearable in his trembling hands. Around them, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, unchanged by the violence that had played out on its ancient stage. The sun climbed higher, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson that would fade to memory but never disappear completely. Justice would be served, but not by his hand. The law would take its course, but tempered by mercy and the hope that truth might finally heal wounds that vengeance could only deepen. In the end, it was Sargent who'd shown them all the way forward, a wounded dog whose capacity for forgiveness exceeded that of the humans who claimed to be his superiors in the great chain of being. The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the desert silence like salvation itself, their rotors beating a rhythm of hope against the endless blue sky. Bill Crawford sat in the shade of what remained of the ancient saguaro, his wounded shoulder bound with strips torn from his shirt, watching as Colonel James Patterson cradled Sergeant's bloodied head in his lap with the tenderness of a man seeking absolution through small acts of mercy. It had been 20 minutes since Bill lowered his weapon, 20 minutes of waiting for help to arrive while the three survivors of this desert tragedy faced truths that would reshape the remainder of their lives. Patterson had made no attempt to flee or fight. He'd simply settled beside the wounded German shepherd and begun speaking in the low, gentle tones that Tommy had once used to calm his four-legged partner after particularly difficult missions. "Easy there, old soldier," Patterson murmured, his weathered fingers carefully avoiding the worst of Sergeant's wounds while still providing comfort. "Help's coming. You just hold on a little longer, you hear me? Your daddy's gonna need you healthy and strong for whatever comes next." The irony wasn't lost on Bill. The man who'd shot his dog was now the one trying to keep him alive while they waited for rescue. But then again, this entire nightmare had been built on ironies and contradictions that would have been laughable if they weren't painted in blood and betrayal. The first helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, disgorging a team of Border Patrol agents led by Deputy Chief Maria Santos, a tough-as-nails veteran who'd worked these badlands longer than most people had been alive. Her dark eyes took in the scene with professional efficiency: scattered bodies, wounded men, and enough evidence to fuel congressional investigations for the next decade. "Jesus Christ, Crawford," Santos said, her voice carrying the kind of weary authority that came from seeing too much violence in too many desolate places. "What the hell happened out here? Looks like World War III broke out in the middle of nowhere." Bill struggled to his feet, favoring his wounded shoulder as he approached the woman who'd been his colleague and friend for the better part of 15 years. Behind her, paramedics were already moving toward Sergeant with the kind of urgent efficiency that suggested they understood the bond between a lawman and his partner transcended species barriers. "Ghost Caravan wasn't a legend, Maria," Bill said simply. "Colonel Patterson here has been running black operations funded by drug money for the better part of 2 decades. That container over there has enough evidence to bring down half the military command structure in the Southwest." Santos' expression shifted from concern to professional intensity as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a shooting in the desert. This was potentially the biggest corruption scandal to hit the military since Iran-Contra, and it had landed squarely in her jurisdiction through the kind of cosmic irony that made career bureaucrats wake up screaming. "Colonel James Patterson," she said, her voice taking on the formal tone of official business, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. You have the right to remain silent." "I waive my rights," Patterson interrupted, his eyes never leaving Sergeant's labored breathing. "I'll tell you everything, Deputy Chief Santos, every operation, every dollar, every death that can be laid at my feet. But first, please, get this dog to a veterinarian. He's lost a lot of blood, and he didn't deserve to suffer for my sins." The second helicopter had landed, bringing with it a federal task force that had been mobilized the moment Bill's emergency beacon had finally broken through the jamming Patterson's people had been using. FBI agents in tactical gear spread out across the crime scene with the methodical precision of professionals who understood that this desert battlefield represented the tip of an iceberg that stretched back decades. Agent Sarah Mackenzie, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s who specialized in military corruption cases, approached Patterson with a digital recorder and the kind of intense focus that suggested she'd been hunting this particular white whale for longer than anyone suspected. "Colonel," she said, her voice carrying both respect for his former rank and absolute determination to see justice done. "We've been trying to connect the Ghost Caravan to military black ops for 8 years. If you're willing to cooperate, we can ensure that your testimony helps bring closure to the families of everyone who died because of these operations." Patterson nodded slowly, finally looking up from Sergeant as the paramedics carefully loaded the German Shepherd onto a stretcher designed for four-legged patients. Tommy figured it out, you know. My son was always too smart for his own good, too honest to let sleeping dogs lie. He was going to expose everything, make sure the families knew why their children had to die. "So you killed him," Mackenzie said, her words carrying no judgment, only the flat acknowledgement of facts that would soon be entered into evidence. "I killed my own son to protect secrets that weren't worth protecting," Patterson confirmed, his voice breaking on the words that would define the remainder of his life. 8 years I've been living with that knowledge, 8 years of watching that dog mourn a handler who died because his father was a coward. Bill watched from a distance as Patterson began his confession, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. Names, dates, operations, financial transactions, decades of carefully hidden corruption spilling into the desert air where it could finally be documented, investigated, and prosecuted. The man who'd once been his closest friend was systematically destroying what remained of his own legacy in the hope that truth might finally serve some greater purpose than the lies that had sustained it. Agent Mackenzie's recorder captured every word, every detail that would help federal prosecutors build cases against the network of officers, contractors, and politicians who'd participated in or benefited from the Ghost Caravan's operations. Some of those names would shock the nation when they were finally revealed. Others would be footnotes in a scandal that would reshape how America conducted its shadow wars. But for Bill Crawford, sitting in the shade of a mutilated cactus with his wounded shoulder throbbing in rhythm with his heartbeat, the most important sound was the steady whine of helicopter rotors carrying Sergeant toward the emergency veterinary clinic in El Paso. Everything else, the arrests, the investigations, the congressional hearings that would follow, was just background noise compared to the simple hope that his four-legged partner might survive to see another sunrise. Deputy Chief Santos approached him with a bottle of water and the kind of gentle expression she reserved for officers who'd been through hell and lived to tell about it. "Paramedic says your shoulder's going to need surgery, Bill. Nothing life-threatening, but you've lost more blood than you should have." "I'm not leaving until I know about Sergeant," Bill said, accepting the water gratefully, but keeping his eyes fixed on the helicopter carrying his partner toward uncertain salvation. "Already called ahead," Santos assured him. "Best veterinary trauma team in Texas is standing by, and the department's picking up all medical expenses. That dog saved more lives today than most humans manage in a lifetime. He's earned whatever care he needs." As the sun climbed toward its zenith, painting the desert in shades of gold and copper that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Bill found himself thinking about the strange turns that had brought them all to this place. A routine patrol had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. A loyal dog had risked everything to protect his human family. A broken man had finally found the courage to tell the truth about sins that had been eating at his soul for nearly a decade. Patterson's confession continued, each revelation more damaging than the last, each name on his list representing another life destroyed by the pursuit of security through shadow and violence. The Ghost Caravan had been just one tentacle of an operation that had funded black sites, assassinations, and regime changes that officially never happened, but unofficially shaped the course of American foreign policy for 2 generations. "Tommy would have been proud," Patterson said during a brief break in his testimony, his eyes finding Bill across the chaotic crime scene. "He always believed the truth was worth dying for. Took me 8 years to understand he was right." Bill nodded, understanding flooding through him like cool water in the desert heat. Tommy Patterson had died not because he'd discovered his father's corruption, but because he'd inherited his father's integrity, the same moral courage that had eventually brought James Patterson to this moment of confession and consequence. The helicopter carrying Sergeant had disappeared into the distance, leaving behind only the memory of rotor wash and the promise of skilled hands working to repair the damage inflicted by this day's violence. Bill closed his eyes and offered a prayer to whatever force might be listening in this vast emptiness, not for vengeance or justice, but simply for the chance to see his partner's tail wag one more time. Around him, the machinery of federal law enforcement processed the scene with methodical efficiency, but Bill's attention was already turning toward the future. There would be trials, testimony, and the slow grinding of justice through courts that would take years to sort through the full scope of what had been hidden in that desert container. But first, there would be a drive to El Paso, a vigil in a veterinary clinic, and the kind of waiting that tested a man's faith in ways that combat never could. Sargent had taught him about loyalty, about sacrifice, about the kind of love that transcended species barriers and made life worth living even in its darkest moments. Now it was Bill's turn to return that loyalty, to wait and hope and trust that sometimes, when the stakes mattered most, love really could conquer the indifference of an uncaring universe. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, unchanged by the violence that had played out on its ancient stage, ready to keep whatever secrets the future might bring to its silent heart. 6 months later, Bill Crawford sat on the front porch of his modest ranch house, watching Sargent chase a tennis ball across the yard with the enthusiastic determination of a dog half his age. The German Shepherd's left shoulder bore a long scar where Patterson's bullet had carved through muscle and sinew, but the veterinary team at El Paso had worked miracles in those first critical hours, saving not just Sargent's life but his mobility and spirit. The physical therapy had been grueling for both of them. Bill's shoulder had required 2 surgeries and months of rehabilitation that left him questioning whether he'd ever regain full use of his left arm. But watching Sargent struggle through his own recovery, seeing the dog's unwavering determination to overcome the limitations imposed by trauma, had given Bill the motivation to push through his own pain and emerge stronger on the other side. The financial rewards from exposing the Ghost Caravan conspiracy had been substantial. Reward money from multiple federal agencies, book deals, speaking engagements, and a comfortable retirement package that ensured Bill would never again face the kind of crushing debt that Mary Beth's medical bills had created. But the real treasure had been simpler. Quiet mornings like this one, with his best friend, healthy and happy, chasing tennis balls in the golden light of a Texas dawn. A black sedan pulled into the driveway, dust rising behind it like a prayer against the clear sky. Bill recognized the vehicle immediately. Agent Sarah Mackenzie had been making regular visits for months, updating him on the progress of prosecutions that had already resulted in 14 convictions and congressional hearings that had reshaped how America conducted its most sensitive operations. "Morning, Bill," Mackenzie said as she climbed out of the sedan, her professional demeanor softened by the kind of genuine warmth that had developed between them over countless hours of testimony and depositions. "How's our hero doing?" Sargent bounded over at the sound of her voice, tail wagging with the enthusiasm he reserved for people who'd proven themselves worthy of trust. The German Shepherd had become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles, the dog who'd helped expose one of the largest military corruption scandals in American history, but he wore his fame with the humble grace that only animals possessed. "He's doing good," Bill said, rising from his chair with only the slightest wince as his shoulder protested the movement. "Started sleeping through the night again last month. No more nightmares about explosions or gunfire. I think he's finally made peace with everything that happened." Mackenzie scratched behind Sargent's ears, earning a contented sigh from the dog who'd once been too traumatized to accept affection from strangers. "That's more than we can say for some of the humans involved. Patterson's testimony has been incredibly detailed, but you can see the toll it's taking on him. Guilt's a hell of a thing when it finally catches up with you." The trial of Colonel James Patterson had been front-page news for weeks, a media circus that exposed not just his crimes, but the entire network of corruption that had flourished in the shadows of America's endless wars. His testimony had been devastating in its completeness. Names, dates, financial records, operational details that painted a picture of systematic abuse of power stretching back decades. But for Bill, the most important moment had come during Patterson's allocution, when the broken man had looked directly at him across the packed courtroom and spoken words that carried the weight of 8 years of guilt and grief. "I killed my son," Patterson had said, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his weathered face. "I killed Tommy Patterson. And I nearly killed the best man I've ever known, and I destroyed the trust of a dog who deserved better from every human he ever served. No sentence this court can impose will equal the punishment I've already imposed on myself. But I hope my cooperation in exposing this conspiracy might help prevent other families from suffering the losses that my actions caused." The judge had sentenced Patterson to 25 years in federal prison with eligibility for parole in 12 soon. At 65, it was effectively a life sentence, but Patterson had accepted it with the stoic dignity of a soldier who'd finally found the courage to face the consequences of his choices. "He asked me to give you this," Mackenzie said, pulling a letter from her briefcase with the careful handling reserved for evidence that might matter more than anyone could measure. "Prison mail is monitored, but he wanted you to know how he feels about everything that happened." Bill accepted the letter with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of emotions he'd been carrying for half a year. Patterson's handwriting was as precise as ever, each word formed with the careful attention to detail that had once made him an exemplary officer before ambition and moral compromise had twisted him into something unrecognizable. The letter was brief, direct, and devastating in its simplicity. "Billy, I know there's nothing I can say that will undo the damage I caused, but I need you to know that Tommy's last words weren't about the evidence he'd found or the corruption he was trying to expose. His last words were, 'Tell my dad I love him, and tell Sergeant he was the best partner a soldier could ask for.' Even dying, he was trying to protect the people he cared about. I spent 8 years thinking I'd killed my son to save my reputation, but the truth is simpler and more damning. I killed him because I was afraid of disappointing him. The irony is that by trying to preserve his respect, I became the one thing he could never have respected, a man who put his own interests above the lives of innocent people. Take care of Sergeant. He's a better soldier than I ever was, and a better friend than I deserved." "Jim." Bill read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in his shirt pocket, next to the small silver cross that Mary Beth had given him on their wedding day. Some weights never fully lifted from a man's shoulders, but they could be borne with greater dignity when shared with those who understood the price of service and sacrifice. Mackenzie watched him with the patient understanding of someone who'd seen too many good people struggle with the aftermath of moral complexity. "He's doing well in prison," she said quietly, "teaching literacy classes, helping other inmates prepare for their GED exams. The warden says he's become something of a father figure to some of the younger convicts. Ironic, considering." A red pickup truck turned into the driveway, followed by a small convoy of cars that Bill recognized immediately. The families of Ghost Caravan victims had been gathering for monthly meetings at his ranch, finding comfort in shared grief and the knowledge that their loved ones' deaths had finally been acknowledged and their killers brought to justice. Maria Santos climbed out of the lead car, her Border Patrol uniform replaced by civilian clothes, but her bearing still carrying the authority of someone who'd dedicated her life to protecting the border. Behind her came the Hendersons, whose son had died in a suspicious convoy attack in Iraq. The Washingtons, whose daughter had been killed in a training accident that investigation had revealed was actually an execution for getting too close to Ghost Caravan operations. and a dozen other families whose grief had been compounded by years of official lies and cover-ups. "Looks like you've got company," Mackenzie observed, gathering her briefcase and preparing to leave. "The Congressional Committee wants to schedule another hearing next month. Nothing major, just follow-up questions about the financial networks. Think you and Sargent are up for another trip to Washington?" Bill nodded, watching as Sargent abandoned his tennis ball to greet each arriving car with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd learned that most humans were good people trying to do their best in a complicated world. The German Shepherd had become an unofficial therapy dog for the families, offering comfort through simple presence and unconditional acceptance that transcended the barriers of language and loss. "We'll be there," Bill said, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who'd found purpose in helping others heal from wounds that might never fully close. These families deserve to have their stories told, and Sargent seems to understand that better than most people. As Mackenzie drove away and the families gathered on his front porch, Bill reflected on the strange turns that had brought them all to this place. A routine patrol had uncovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. A loyal dog had risked everything to protect his human family. A broken man had finally found the courage to tell the truth about sins that had been eating at his soul for nearly a decade. The desert had given up its secrets, but it had also taught them all something valuable about the nature of redemption. Sometimes the greatest loyalty meant leading someone toward the truth, even when that truth was painful beyond measure. Sometimes love required forgiveness of the unforgivable, and sometimes healing could only come through the patient work of helping others find their own way back to wholeness. Sargent dropped his tennis ball at Bill's feet and looked up with those impossibly expressive brown eyes, tail wagging with the simple joy of a creature who'd learned to trust again despite every reason to remain guarded. In that moment, surrounded by people who'd found family and shared loss and purpose in mutual support, Bill Crawford understood that he was exactly where he belonged. The desert stretched endlessly beyond his property line, keeping whatever secrets the future might bring, but no longer holding any power over the lives that had been reclaimed from its silent embrace. At 62, Bill Crawford discovered something profound. The deepest happiness doesn't come from avoiding loss, but from finding purpose within it. Like so many of us who've buried spouses, lost friends, or watched our bodies betray promises of eternal strength, Bill faced a choice between bitter isolation and meaningful connection. When Mary Beth's medical bills crushed his dreams and cancer stole his beloved wife, he could have retreated into the safe loneliness that guards against future heartbreak. Instead, he chose to love again, adopting a traumatized military dog named Sargent who needed healing as desperately as he did. Together, they discovered that second chances aren't just possible, they're sacred. Their bond transcended species, proving that family isn't defined by blood, but by who stands beside you when the desert winds howl. Through their journey from mutual brokenness to shared purpose, Bill learned that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in morning coffee shared with a loyal friend, in quiet evenings watching sunset paint the sky, in the simple grace of being needed and needed in return. Sometimes our greatest happiness blooms from the soil of our deepest sorrows, watered by tears, but nourished by love. What relationship in your life has taught you the most about unconditional love? Have you ever found unexpected family in the most unlikely places? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you've discovered happiness after heartbreak.